I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your day to join us to talk about end of year giving in 2022. 2022 was an interesting year for fundraising, and we'll delve into that in a minute. But first, I'll introduce myself and allow my esteemed colleagues to do the same. My name is Jane Shepard. I am Senior Vice President at MissionWired. I've worked in digital marketing for over 20 years, and both agency side and also at some major nonprofit brands, including the Alzheimer's Association and St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Claire, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Schwark. I'm an Associate Creative Director here at MissionWired, and I've led the creative strategy for a handful of our nonprofit partners during quite a few end of years at this point. So I'm excited to dive into some creative insights for you all today. And I'll kick it over to Abhi.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, my name is Abhi Reddy. I'm a digital strategist here at MissionWired. I help several of our largest nonprofit teams, not only throughout the end of the year, but through all of their creative campaigns over the years, throughout email, SMS, and ads, and really excited that all of you are joining us today. Great, so I think before we kind of kick off the formal webinar portion, we wanted to take a little bit of time here to kind of go through a couple poll questions that we put together just to see where everyone's at in terms of how they think end of year went and some of the learnings that we have as well. So right over here on this next slide is that first question right away. So I'm going to launch a poll feature in a second and would love to get your input here, but would love to throw it out to everyone and see what they thought the most used channel for marketers in 2022 was. And we actually do have data on this as well. So there'll be an answer here shortly with what statistically it was as well. So we'll give everyone a little bit of time to answer this, just around a minute here. Great, so it looks like all answers are actually in there. So most of the people attending this webinar put an email. That's around 56% of attendees, and that would be correct. According to a study of response rates in 2022, email was the most used medium at 77%, followed by social at 74%, and then SMS was only deployed by 24% of marketers. As we'll be talking about a little bit later in the webinar, that's one of the areas that we saw the most potential for growth in over end of year and beyond. But with that, to our second question, also wanted to see what everyone thought the types of scenarios that might have hurt or depressed end of year engagement this year might have been. Definitely was a bit of a more challenging environment than us as marketers might have been used to, but would love to see what everyone thinks. Just a couple more seconds here for everyone to get their responses in. Almost everyone's in. Perfect. So most people had either economic recession or all of the above. And from our perspective, it seems to be all the above. So end of year 2022 came with a variety of challenges that hadn't been seen in previous years, but working with our partners, we anticipated and implemented various strategies to overcome those, which we'll be breaking down as we kind of continue through the rest of today's webinar. And then also wanted to test out what everyone thought the single most liked Instagram post of 2022 is. Just kind of as like a fun question right at the end to throw in. Great. We'll give everyone a couple more seconds to get them responses. Perfect. So you might have thought that it maybe was something related to Midnight's, the album of the year, and a lot of our employees' opinions, but it was actually Messi's post over when Argentina won the World Cup. Definitely an incredible moment, and I'm sure many of you have seen them match. One of the highlights of the year for sure. But with that, kind of want to kick it back into digital marketing right away and pass it back over to Jane, who's going to be talking through some of the environment for end of year 2022.
Thanks, Abby. So 2022 was an interesting year. We had sort of a return to normalcy after our 2 pandemic years. I will not call us a post-COVID environment, but more of a return to normalcy for sure. And so 2022 overall was more challenging than the past years. I think we saw folks with a little bit less disposable income because they were going out more, doing more, and then inflation contributed to that, of course, as well. On top of that, when we're thinking about things from a digital perspective, because folks were getting out more, they had more things going on. They weren't as glued to their inboxes or their phones. So the fight to get their attention was a little bit more challenging. We've got retention of emergency donors in here too. And the reason for that is there were a lot of emergencies last year, and the big one was the war in Ukraine. And a lot of orgs got a lot of new donors in from that emergency situation. And we know that always it's a challenge to get those folks to give again when we come into year end or anytime really. And for folks who, for orgs that weren't relevant to that emergency, that provided a little bit of, I won't call it competition, but there was a lot of noise and distraction in the news cycle around that, along with the death of the Queen as well, that made fundraising a little bit challenging. It was, again, difficult to get that share of attention. And then finally, I'll share, in addition to that return to normalcy, we saw the return of the high travel season in 2022. So once again, during the month of December, folks were a little bit more busy. It was harder to get their attention. So I'll pass it back over to Abby, and he'll share some of the benchmarks we saw as a result.
Thanks, Jane. So we also wanted to share some of the benchmarks that we saw throughout year end from some of our clients, just for kind of some information on the lay of the landscape from what we saw. So a trend that we saw right away was that average email volume was up per organization. We had clients sending an average of 37 emails between the beginning of November and the end of December in 2021, and that was up to an average of 39 per client. Of course, that varies with the program. We had programs sending far fewer emails and then also far more, as I'm sure your inboxes saw firsthand. We also had response rates stay pretty consistent from year to year at a 0.04% response rate, but we did see average revenue growth slightly down from 2021 to 2022. And this kind of goes in with a lot of the environmental factors that were coming into play that Jane talked about. But we're also going to talk about some ways that some of our clients and other programs were able to break through some of that noise and still achieve remarkable growth regardless. But did want to also spend some time kind of looking at a couple other benchmarks here. Average email volume per organization during final stretch was slightly up as well. No surprise here, organizations have taken more and more advantage of each of those final stretch days throughout the years, but we also saw average email response rates slightly increase during those time periods. So it looks like those last couple days of the year still did see a overall growth in average response rate among the programs that we work with. But that being said, did want to spend some time also looking through pacing and volume. And Jane actually has a couple insights to share there with the entire webinar.
Thanks, Abby. So we're showing the pacing of giving in 2022 for November and December here. And you see a big peak right around Giving Tuesday, and you see a big peak right around year end. And no one's surprised by this, right? But the thing that's interesting here is this was, again, a little bit of a return to normalcy. In 2020 and 2021, we saw a little bit more, and I wish I had a pointer here. We saw a little bit more activity in that year of that month of December, whereas now we're kind of back to normal, where we just see the big spikes right there on Giving Tuesday, and then in that final week of the year. And the way the holiday fell, I think this past year was a little challenging too, where the Christmas holiday observed fell on a Monday instead of in the prior year where it was the Friday before the weekend. And so it really tightened that time frame for that end of year push. And Abby, if you'll go to the next slide, I can share too another way of looking at this really, which is just the top fundraising days. If you go back to 2021, they're sprinkled in throughout December, right? In 2022, it's all about, we've got the day after Giving Tuesday here, and then those final days of the year. So again, with more of this return to normalcy in terms of giving behavior. Next up, we'll talk about some tactics.
Great. So, of course, a tried and true tactic that's been used year after year are resends, but we really saw them shine this year, especially when inboxes became even more crowded. I'm sure many of you here have noticed that Giving Tuesday itself is not just Giving Tuesday anymore. It's the days that lead up to it, the days that come after, and corporations have also started getting into the mix with their own Giving Tuesday campaigns right after and before the busy Black Friday period as well. And so with such crowded inboxes, with many donors, needed resends to kind of have extra touch points with organizations. So during a tight year-end week, as well as during Giving Week, a strategy that shined for many of our partners was kind of doubling down on those resends to those in the audience that didn't open for the first time. And several organizations that we partner with utilize those to increase their email volumes on the last days of the year, or to extend the tail of Giving Tuesday out throughout the rest of the week. So a couple case studies here. One organization that we work with saw 19% of their Giving Tuesday email revenue come entirely from resends, whereas another organization we worked with, top raising email in 2022 was a Giving Tuesday resend as well. And I know many of the organizations I've worked with have seen similar results here too. One organization that I work with actually saw 24% of their email revenue on December 31st come from resends. They've just become increasingly important in the landscape and have been a great way to kind of get some extra mileage out of those creative pieces that we all put so much work into. Also did want to use some time here to talk about paid search. So paid search saw another major surge among many of our partners this year for the second year running. And last year, many of our nonprofit partners were actually surprised to see paid search investments skyrocketing during the final stretch of year end, leaving a lot of these organizations wondering if this was a trend that would perhaps repeat during 2022. And much to their relief, it did. So for one environmental organization that we worked with, we saw a 365% year-over-year increase in ads, largely due to great results in paid search. And for another, a $50,000 gift through paid search made a big difference in their end of year results. For another major international aid organization that we worked with, also saw a big difference in their year-end results and had their fundraising goals surpassed by Christmas, largely due to paid search. They increased that spend massively during those last couple of days of the year to invest more in paid search, and were able to return even more in those last couple of days. A lesson that we kind of saw here through many of our clients was that they started that paid search creative around final stretch a bit earlier in the year, even the week before Christmas or perhaps earlier than that, which allowed them to optimize the content there and make sure by the time we got around to the actual final stretch week, only the best content there was running. But we also know that the crux of a lot of these messages across email as well as ads were the creative pieces themselves, which is why I want to also pass it over to Claire to talk about some of that creative that we saw stand out during the year.
Thanks, Avi. Yes, excited to dig into some of the creative behind the numbers we've been talking about. So first here, you can see this supporter map. So for one of our nonprofit partners, a top performing Giving Tuesday email utilized the map that you see on this slide, which shows people donating all over the country using a GIF with these kind of stars popping up. So paired with the thermometer below depicting, being short of goal and the fact that the supporter hasn't donated yet, this proved to just be really compelling for the audience, driving a really strong revenue performance for their email program. And on the next slide here, you can see a trend that dominated actually both at Giving Tuesday and end of year for several of our partners. And that trend is eye-catching graphics right at the top of the email, topped with a compelling news headline that demonstrates, an immediate need for donations. And to just further underscore, how effective these graphics are, one of our partners actually saw a significant drop in results for any emails that they sent out without graphics. So that's an incredibly useful insight for any organizations whose missions offer the opportunity to use really compelling imagery. It's clear that utilizing that whenever possible does lift performance. So similar to, those immediate eye-catching graphics, some of our partners found that incorporating movement into their end-of-year emails through GIFs also drove a really strong response. And that's anything from countdown clocks to, donation buttons that look like they're being clicked on. And the examples that you can see here from the USO, show a slideshow GIF of really powerful imagery of our military, and then also a calendar GIF that's just a really creative, visually engaging way to show someone that they're running out of time to take action before the deadline. And in both instances here, these drove really strong revenue performances. And now that brings us to forwards. So when it came to forwards this year, it's kind of all in the title of the slide. Results varied. Some environmental and humanitarian organizations that we work with saw that emails without graphics and forwards in particular drove some of the lowest response rates. But at the same time, forwards were among, the top performing emails for organizations in other fields like hospitals and healthcare, where more copy forward creative approaches can kind of resonate a bit more with audiences. So I think the real takeaway from this range of results is that, in the biggest moments of the year, knowing your audience and what they respond to best is really the key to success. And a similar story can kind of be told for matches as well. We know that being able to utilize one is consistently effective. But the real question is between using a consistent match multiplier across an end of year campaign versus increasing the multiplier as the campaign progresses. And this is another place where it depends on the organization. Some of our partners found success with being able to, have like an announcement of a big multiplier increase. Others found success with sticking with a consistent multiplier across the board. So again, the takeaway here is really just focusing on what your audience responds to best and leading into that in such an important moment. And with that, I can turn it back over to Jane.
Thanks, Claire. So Claire just went through a lot of the excellent creative that our team put together to help raise revenue, but we know it's not just about the creative that's sent, it's also about whom it's sent to, right? So something that emerged this year as a real competitive advantage we noticed is the digital co-op. And our digital co-op is the first ever and still the only digital acquisition source of its kind. It's the only place where you can get new email addresses to send to, the first co-op anyway. And the origins of it are really from, you may be familiar with direct mail co-ops, which have been around for decades, where different nonprofit orgs pull together their names, and then they pull out new names for acquisition and they send them mail. Well, we have created the same thing, but for email and other digital sources, and we take into account email exhaust data too. So the names that we're providing are folks that we know will open your emails, so they won't be a risk to deliverability. And we have, sophisticated models and AI that can pick out who's most likely to give to your cause. So we've got more than 170 members now. And again, this really emerged as a competitive advantage that we saw this year. This is open to any org to join. And over the course of its existence, which is a few years old now, every co-op acquisition we've seen has broken even in less than 12 months. And this year, in 2022, it became a more competitive landscape for acquisition. We certainly saw that folks' investments in acquisition on Facebook were not performing the way they used to, and this really saved the day in a lot of cases. So if you go to the next slide, please, I'll share some results. It's a totally blind co-op. We won't share any members' names, but I can share these really exciting results. And these are for different sizes of orgs, from a small org to a very large org too. So for organization A that we're talking about here, they ended up shifting the majority of their acquisition budget to the co-op when Facebook was not working out for them, and ended up exceeding their year-end goal. For organization B that we're talking about here, they saw 65%, this is a mid-sized organization, they saw 65% year-over-year increase in their fundraising in just the last week of the year alone, which, as you saw in the slide that I showed earlier, ended up being really the critical time for fundraising in end of year 2022. And then finally, one of our larger members used our reactivation model, which is, I think probably everyone here knows that sending to folks who are not opening is a big no-no from an email deliverability perspective. We're able to take your inactive list and then tell you, all right, try sending to these people. They're probably going to open, or they're more likely to open. Don't send to these people. And as a result, when they invested in that, they saw a 100% ROI within just 10 days on that investment. So these are really exciting developments. We continue to grow this co-op. As I said, we're over 170 members now, and we've got more joining all the time. And with every new member, our models just get smarter. Next slide, please.
Great. So also wanted to take some time here to talk about email volume. That's definitely been a trend that we've seen for a couple of years now, with each and every year organizations needing to send more and more messages to make sure that they stand out in inboxes. So over here we have a pretty simple chart. So pretty consistently since 2017, with the exception of 2018, there's a little blip there. We've seen organizations have their email volume over Giving Tuesday, as well as Final Stretch, increasing year over year. The email inbox environment has become more crowded than ever, which is why it's really important that when we're looking at creative, we're looking at creative that stands out, and that you're approaching acquisition strategically. It's always great to, of course, have more names on the list, but if those names are at the end of the day not opening, engaging, and donating, there's limited value that they might have for email program. But with that, also wanted to pass it over back to Jane to talk about one of the most exciting developments that we've seen in many of our partners over 2022, SMS program and their growth.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, this is one other area where we noticed that our clients tend to have a competitive advantage, and where we saw really good gains. So hopefully those of you on this call have begun to invest in an SMS program. What I have here are the results from one client in particular. And really the takeaway here is you can see from 2021 to 2022, a shift in the share of revenue from SMS from 29% to 36%. What you don't see here is that in 2022, the pie is actually bigger. So we're talking about more revenue overall, and the majority of that growth actually coming from SMS. Now, this is an example from one client, but this is a trend that we're seeing across many of our clients. And it really just speaks to the fact that as things are getting more challenging in the channels that we've really leaned on for so long, in SMS, in email, and ads, investing in these new channels is becoming more and more important if you want to continue to grow your program.